My name is General Victoria Sterling. I'm 42 years old. I served in the United States Marine Corps for 22 years, rising from a scared 18-year-old recruit to the first female four-star general in Marine Corps history. 4 combat deployments, 3 Purple Hearts, and a Medal of Honor that sits in a dusty box because I never had a mantelpiece to display it on. My family erased me from my own sister's wedding program, removed my name from the seating chart, and told guests I was too busy with military stuff to attend. Then the groom's father, a man I'd never met, stood up during the reception, looked directly at me, and saluted with tears in his eyes, saying loud enough for everyone to hear, "4-star General Victoria Sterling. Ma'am, it's an honor." Sometimes the recognition you've been waiting for your whole life comes from a stranger who understands what your own blood never could. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I wasn't supposed to be a general. Hell, I wasn't supposed to be anything, according to my family. Growing up in a small town outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, I was the middle child sandwiched between my older brother Marcus, who could do no wrong, and my younger sister Sophia, who was beautiful enough to make people forget she had no ambition beyond finding a husband with money. My parents, Thomas and Margaret Whitmore, ran a successful insurance agency and spent most of their energy making sure our family looked perfect from the outside. Perfect house, perfect cars, perfect Christmas cards, sent to everyone in their social circle. I was the wrinkle in their carefully pressed fabric. At 15, I was already 5'9", broad-shouldered, and more comfortable in work boots than the heels my mother kept buying me. While Sophia practiced walking in pageant dresses, I was in the garage rebuilding motorcycle engines with my grandfather, the only person who ever looked at me like I had potential. He'd fought in Korea, never talked about it much, but I could see something in his eyes when he watched the news about military conflicts overseas. A recognition, a respect, a weight that I didn't understand then but would carry myself decades later. My mother despised everything about me that wasn't traditionally feminine. The way I sat with my legs apart. The way I spoke directly instead of softly. The way I'd rather spend Saturday mornings at the shooting range with Grandpa than at the mall with her and Sophia. She'd sigh dramatically whenever I walked into a room, as if my very existence was a personal failing she'd have to explain to the neighbors. "Victoria, sweetheart," she'd say in that voice that was honey with poison underneath, "you're going to need to learn to soften if you want anyone to love you." My father was different, but not better. He ignored me mostly, pouring all his attention into Marcus, who played varsity football and planned to take over the family business someday. When I made varsity track as a sophomore, breaking 3 school records in distance running, he missed every single meet. When I scored a perfect 1600 on my SATs, he grunted approval and went back to his newspaper. When I announced I was joining the Marines the day after graduation, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "That's not what normal girls do, Victoria. But then again, you were never normal, were you?" The night before I left for Paris Island, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and tears in her eyes. Not sad tears, frustrated tears. "I don't understand where I went wrong with you," she said, stirring her tea in perfect circles. "Sophia knows how to make people comfortable, how to make them feel good about themselves. Marcus knows how to lead without making people feel threatened. But you're always so intense, so serious. People don't know what to do with you." I remember staring at the steam rising from my untouched cup, thinking about how she'd just described everything I was proud of about myself as if it were a disease. "Maybe that's not my problem to fix," I said quietly. She set down her spoon with a sharp clink against the porcelain and looked at me like I'd just confirmed her worst fears. "With that attitude, you're going to end up alone, Victoria. Mark my words." Boot camp was brutal, but it was the first place I'd ever been where being intense and serious wasn't just accepted, it was required. The drill instructors broke us down to nothing and built us back up into something harder, something purposeful. While my family was probably relieved to have me out of their perfectly manicured lives, I was learning what it meant to be part of something bigger than myself. I discovered I had a gift for leadership, for making split-second decisions under pressure, for earning respect through competence rather than charm. My first deployment was to Iraq in 2003. I was a second lieutenant, green as grass, leading a platoon of Marines who were mostly older than me and initially skeptical of taking orders from a woman. But combat has a way of burning away everything that doesn't matter. When the mortars started falling and the bullets started flying, nobody cared about my gender or my age. They cared about whether I could get them home alive. I could, and I did, mission after mission, patrol after patrol. I lost Marines along the way, too many. But I never lost one because I hesitated or second-guessed myself. The medal came during my third deployment, Afghanistan 2008. We were escorting a convoy through a valley that intelligence said was clear. It wasn't. The ambush was textbook perfect, hitting us from 3 sides with RPGs and small arms fire. The lead vehicle was disabled, the rear vehicle was taking heavy fire, and we were pinned down in a kill box with nowhere to run. I made a decision that probably should have gotten me killed. I took 4 Marines and flanked left, drawing fire away from the main group while my sergeant led the evacuation of the wounded. We held that position for 47 minutes, long enough for air support to arrive and extract everyone. I took shrapnel in my shoulder and a bullet through my thigh, but all 23 Marines in that convoy went home. The Medal of Honor ceremony was surreal. There I was, standing in the East Room of the White House, having the highest military decoration in the country placed around my neck by the President of the United States. The citation read like someone else's life, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. My family attended, sitting in the front row, smiling for the cameras. Afterwards, at the reception, my mother spent the entire time talking to other guests about how proud she was, how she'd always known I was special, how military service runs in our family. She didn't mention the years of criticism, the constant pressure to be someone else. The way she'd acted like my career was a phase I'd eventually outgrow. The promotions came steadily after that: captain, major, lieutenant colonel, colonel. Each rank brought new responsibilities, new challenges, new opportunities to prove myself. I commanded units of increasing size and complexity, deployed to theaters around the world, earned advanced degrees in strategic studies and international relations. I was building something, carving out a place where I belonged, where my intensity and seriousness weren't flaws to be hidden, but strengths to be leveraged. But even as I climbed the ranks, my family's attitude toward me remained fundamentally unchanged. They were proud of my success in the abstract. It was something they could brag about at dinner parties, but they never seemed to understand what that success actually meant. My mother would introduce me to her friends as my daughter the general, but in the same breath she'd ask when I was going to settle down and give her grandchildren. My father would nod approvingly when news articles mentioned my promotions, but he never asked about the weight of command, the decisions that kept me awake at night, the responsibility of leading thousands of Marines in life-or-death situations. Marcus, now running the family business, treated my career like an extended rebellious phase. "It's impressive, Vic," he'd say, "but what's your exit strategy? You can't do this forever. What happens when you want real life?" Sophia, married to a lawyer and mother of 3, was more direct. "I just don't understand how you can be happy living like that," she'd say, gesturing vaguely at my uniform when I came home on leave. "Always traveling, always working, no husband, no kids. What's the point of all those medals if you're alone?" The loneliness was real, but it wasn't the kind they imagined. I wasn't lonely because I lacked traditional markers of success: marriage, children, a house with a white picket fence. I was lonely because the people who were supposed to know me best had never made any effort to understand who I actually was. They saw the uniform, the rank, the recognition, but they never saw the person underneath. They never asked about the Marines I'd lost, the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives, the pride I felt in serving something bigger than myself. When I became Brigadier General, becoming the youngest female general in Marine Corps history, the celebration at home was typical. A nice dinner, congratulations all around, and then immediate questions about what came next. "So you're done now, right?" my mother asked, cutting into her perfectly prepared salmon. "You've proven whatever you needed to prove. Maybe it's time to think about settling down." I tried to explain that this was just the beginning, that there were higher ranks to achieve, bigger responsibilities to take on, more Marines to lead. She nodded politely and changed the subject to Sophia's latest pregnancy. The 4th star came 12 years later, after commands in 3 different theaters, advanced training at the War College, and a stint at the Pentagon that nearly broke me with its political complexity. The promotion ceremony was smaller than the Medal of Honor presentation, but no less significant. I was now one of only a handful of four-star generals in the entire Marine Corps, responsible for strategic planning at the highest levels of military leadership. The weight of it was enormous, but so was the honor. My family's reaction was predictable: pride mixed with confusion, congratulations tinged with concern. 4 stars, my father said, shaking his head. That's really something, Victoria, but what does that mean for your personal life? You're 42 years old. Time is running out if you want a family. I wanted to tell him that I already had a family. Hundreds of thousands of Marines who looked to me for leadership, for guidance, for the kind of strength that had taken me decades to develop. But I knew he wouldn't understand. None of them would. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent my entire adult life earning respect from some of the most demanding people on Earth: drill instructors, combat veterans, 4-star generals, presidents. But the respect I'd always craved most, the simple acknowledgement from my own family that I was exactly who I was supposed to be, remained elusive. They loved me, I think, but they loved a version of me that existed only in their imaginations. The version that would eventually come to her senses, leave the military, and become the daughter they'd always wanted. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, just as I was finishing my daily briefing at Camp Pendleton. My aide knocked on my office door with that particular hesitation that meant personal business was interrupting military business. "General Sterling, your sister is on line 3. She says it's urgent." I glanced at the stack of intelligence reports on my desk, the meeting schedule that ran until 2,100 hours, and the video conference with Pacific Command scheduled for 1400. In my world, urgent meant casualties, security breaches, or international incidents. In Sophia's world, urgent meant her manicure appointment got moved. "Victoria!" Her voice was breathless with excitement, the way it used to sound when she got asked to homecoming dances. "I have incredible news. David proposed last night. We're getting married in October, and I want you to be my maid of honor." David Chen was the lawyer she'd been dating for 2 years, a partner at a prestigious firm in Charlotte who drove a Tesla and wore watches that cost more than most people's cars. He was exactly the kind of man my parents had always hoped I'd find: successful, conventional, safe. I felt something warm spread through my chest, something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my family. She wanted me to be her maid of honor, not just a bridesmaid lost in a lineup of college friends, but the person standing beside her during the most important moment of her life. "Sophia, that's wonderful. I'm honored. Really honored." I was already mentally rearranging my schedule, thinking about leave requests and ceremonial uniform protocols. A Marine Corps general at a civilian wedding would require some coordination, but it was doable. It was more than doable. It was exactly the kind of bridge-building moment our family needed. "There's so much to plan," she continued, her voice taking on that rapid-fire quality that meant she was making lists in her head. "We're thinking October 15th at the Grandview Country Club. 300 guests, maybe more. David's family is huge, and Daddy wants to invite everyone from the agency. You'll need to get fitted for a dress, obviously, something elegant but not too military-looking, if you know what I mean." I didn't know what she meant, but I let it slide. This was her day, her moment, her dream wedding. I could wear whatever she wanted. Over the next 3 weeks, I threw myself into maid of honor duties with the same intensity I brought to military planning. I researched wedding traditions, coordinated with the other bridesmaids, and even took leave to fly to Charlotte for the dress fitting. The bridal shop was exactly the kind of place I'd avoided my entire adult life, all pink and gold and mirrors positioned to make everyone look like they were floating on clouds. Sophia emerged from the dressing room in a creation that cost more than I'd spent on my car, looking like every fairy tale princess she'd ever dreamed of becoming. "You look perfect," I told her, and meant it. She beamed at me in the mirror, adjusting the veil that cascaded down her back like a waterfall of silk and lace. "I can't believe it's really happening," she said softly. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and it'll all be a dream." I stood behind her, my hands on her shoulders, feeling more connected to my little sister than I had in years. This was what family was supposed to feel like: sharing important moments, supporting each other through major life transitions, being present for the milestones that mattered. The maid of honor dress was a deep, burgundy color that actually looked decent on me, despite my broad shoulders and military posture. The sales associate, a tiny woman with perfectly styled hair, kept trying to convince me to add more accessories: a delicate necklace, dangling earrings, a clutch purse covered in beads. "You want to look feminine," she insisted, "romantic. This is a wedding, not a board meeting." I let her fuss over me, trying on different combinations of jewelry and shoes, because seeing Sophia's excitement made the discomfort worth it. The bridal shower was held at my mother's house, transformed into a garden party paradise with white tablecloths, rose centerpieces, and enough champagne to float a small ship. Sophia's friends from college filled the living room, all perfect hair and designer handbags, cooing over lingerie and kitchen appliances. I felt like an anthropologist studying a foreign culture, watching these women navigate conversations about thread counts and place settings with the seriousness I usually reserved for strategic planning sessions. When it came time for Sophia to open gifts, I handed her a carefully wrapped box containing a set of Waterford crystal glasses I'd ordered from Ireland. She lifted one to the light, admiring the way it caught the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. "Victoria, these are beautiful. They must have cost a fortune." I shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "They're an investment. You'll have them for 50 years. What I didn't say was that I'd spent 3 hours researching the perfect gift, reading reviews and comparing patterns, because I wanted to give her something that would last, something that would remind her of this moment decades from now. My mother stood up to make a toast, her voice carrying the practiced warmth she used for social occasions. "To Sophia, who has always known exactly what she wanted and had the grace to wait for the right man to provide it." The room erupted in applause and laughter, glasses clinking and cameras flashing. I raised my champagne flute with everyone else, but something about the phrasing bothered me. Had the grace to wait for the right man to provide it, as if Sophia's worth was determined by her ability to attract a provider, rather than her own accomplishments. The shower games that followed were an exercise in patience. Guessing how many kisses were in a jar, creating wedding dresses out of toilet paper, matching famous couples from movies and television. I participated with good humor, even winning the trivia contest about romantic comedies. Apparently, my mandatory movie nights during deployment had been more educational than I'd realized. But throughout the afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was performing a role rather than being myself. Every time I laughed at the right moment or made an appropriately feminine comment, I felt like I was betraying some essential part of who I was. The bachelorette party was worse. Sophia had chosen a weekend in Charleston, complete with a horse-drawn carriage tour, a cooking class, and a night out at bars where the drinks came in glasses shaped like penises. I endured the giggling and the games, the constant photography and the matching t-shirts that said, "Sophia's Squad," in glittery letters. When the other bridesmaids started sharing stories about their worst dates and their relationship drama, I found myself with nothing to contribute. My romantic history was sparse and complicated, involving mostly military personnel who understood the demands of my career but couldn't handle the reality of dating someone who outranked them. "Victoria, you're so quiet," said Jennifer, Sophia's college roommate, after her 4th Cosmopolitan. "Come on, tell us about your love life. There must be some hot military guys throwing themselves at you." The table went silent, everyone leaning forward with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for celebrity gossip. I took a sip of my wine and chose my words carefully. My career doesn't leave much time for dating, and most men aren't comfortable with the idea of their girlfriend being able to order them to do push-ups. The laughter that followed was polite but strained, and I realized I'd said the wrong thing. These women wanted romantic stories, meet-cute anecdotes, tales of passion and heartbreak. They didn't want to hear about the reality of being a woman in a male-dominated profession, about the isolation that came with command responsibility, about the choice between professional success and personal connection that I'd made so many times I'd stopped thinking of it as a choice. Later that night, back at the hotel, Sophia sat on the edge of my bed in her matching pajamas, her face flushed from wine and excitement. "I'm so glad you're here," she said, reaching for my hand. "I know this isn't really your scene, but it means everything to me that you're participating." Mom always said you'd come around eventually, that you'd realize family is more important than career. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I never said career was more important than family. I said I wanted both. She squeezed my hand, her expression softening into something that might have been pity. I know, but look at where you are. You're 42, Victoria. You're successful, sure, but you're alone. Don't you want someone to take care of you for once? Don't you want to be the one wearing the white dress? The conversation continued for another hour, Sophia offering advice about online dating and suggesting I consider early retirement to focus on finding someone. She meant well, I knew that, but every suggestion felt like a gentle insult. Every piece of advice like a solution to a problem I didn't have. When she finally went back to her own room, I sat alone in the darkness, staring out at the Charleston harbor and wondering why the people who were supposed to know me best seemed to understand me least. The wedding planning intensified as October approached. There were venue visits and menu tastings, flower arrangements, and seating charts. I attended everything I could, rearranging my schedule and using precious leave time to be present for decisions about linens and lighting. But gradually I began to notice small changes. My input was requested less frequently. My opinions were acknowledged politely but rarely implemented. When I suggested a modification to the ceremony timeline to accommodate my military obligations, my mother looked at me with exasperation and said, "Victoria, this isn't a military operation. It's a wedding, can't you just blend in for once?" The final dress fitting was scheduled for a Saturday in September. I flew in from a NATO summit in Brussels, still running on European time and carrying the weight of 3 days of strategic planning sessions. The bridal shop was exactly as I remembered it, but something felt different. The energy was more subdued, the conversations more careful. When I emerged from the dressing room in the burgundy dress, the silence stretched too long. "It looks lovely," my mother finally said, but her voice lacked conviction. Although, she exchanged glances with Sophia, one of those wordless communications that had excluded me since childhood. "We've been thinking about the photographs. You know, the formal family portraits. Victoria, you have such a distinctive presence. We don't want you to overshadow the bride." I stared at my reflection in the three-way mirror, trying to understand what I was seeing that they found so objectionable. My posture was straight, my shoulders squared, the bearing of someone who had spent decades learning to command respect. My expression was serious, focused, the face of someone who took important moments seriously. But apparently, these qualities that had served me well in every other aspect of my life were a liability at my sister's wedding. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would hurt. Sophia stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Maybe you could sit during the ceremony instead of standing with the bridal party. You'd still be included, obviously, but in a way that doesn't compete with the aesthetic we're going for." The aesthetic. As if I were a piece of furniture that didn't match the decor. I nodded slowly, feeling that familiar childhood sensation of being the square peg in a family of round holes. "Of course, whatever you think is best." The seamstress made notes about alterations, shortening the dress and adjusting the neckline to make it more guest-appropriate. I stood there like a mannequin, being reconfigured to fit someone else's vision of how I should exist in the world. The drive back to the base was quiet, the Carolina countryside blurring past as I processed what had just happened. I'd been demoted from maid of honor to wedding guest, reduced from participant to observer, and the most painful part was that I understood their reasoning. In a world of soft curves and gentle smiles, I was all hard angles and direct eye contact. In a celebration of traditional femininity, I was a reminder of all the ways a woman could choose to be different. That night, I sat in my quarters and pulled out the speech I'd been writing for the reception. 3 pages of carefully crafted words about sisterhood and love, about watching Sophia grow up and being proud of the woman she'd become. I read it over twice, then folded it carefully and put it away. If I wasn't going to be the maid of honor, there would be no speech. If I wasn't going to stand beside her during the ceremony, there would be no moment to share my carefully prepared words about family and commitment. I told myself it didn't matter. I'd been excluded from bigger things than wedding parties. I'd been the only woman in rooms full of men, the only Marine in rooms full of politicians, the only person willing to make hard decisions when everyone else wanted to compromise. I'd learned to find my strength in solitude, my purpose in service to something larger than myself. But as I stared at the folded speech in my desk drawer, I realized that some wounds never completely heal. Some rejections cut deeper than others, especially when they come from the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear, the kind of perfect autumn day that makes wedding photographers weep with joy. I stood at the window of my hotel room, watching the sun paint the Charlotte skyline in shades of gold and amber, and tried to summon the enthusiasm I'd felt when Sophia first asked me to be her maid of honor. That invitation felt like a lifetime ago, buried under weeks of gentle exclusions and careful repositioning. I had been transformed from the person standing beside her at the altar to just another face in the crowd, another guest with a +1 line crossed out because, Victoria, you understand, seating is so complicated. My dress hung on the bathroom door, not the burgundy maid of honor gown I'd been fitted for, but a navy blue cocktail dress I'd purchased at the last minute when it became clear that matching the wedding party was no longer my concern. It was elegant enough for the occasion but unremarkable enough to blend into the background, which seemed to be everyone's preferred outcome. I'd spent an hour the previous evening researching appropriate wedding guest attire, something I'd never had to worry about when I was part of the wedding party. The irony wasn't lost on me that I could plan military operations involving thousands of personnel but felt completely adrift navigating the social politics of my own sister's wedding. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Remember, the ceremony starts at 4 o'clock sharp. Family photos at 5:30. Please try to smile and look natural. Please try to smile. Part stung more than it should have. As if smiling was something I'd forgotten how to do. As if looking natural was a skill I'd lost somewhere between boot camp and 4-star general. I typed back a simple "Roger that" and immediately regretted it. Even my text messages sounded military. Even my acknowledgments were reminders of how different I was from the rest of them. The Grandview Country Club was exactly what I'd expected. All manicured lawns and classical columns, the kind of place where old money went to feel comfortable with new money. Valets in crisp uniforms directed a stream of luxury vehicles toward the parking area, while guests in pastels and pearls made their way toward the ceremony site. I watched from my rental car as familiar faces from my childhood moved through the crowd, people I hadn't seen in years but who would undoubtedly remember me as the sterling girl who went into the military instead of getting married. The ceremony was set up in the club's rose garden, with white chairs arranged in perfect rows facing a pergola draped in cascading flowers. Everything was precisely coordinated, from the ribbon-tied programs to the rose petals scattered along the aisle. I found my seat in the third row, between my father's business partner and his wife, people I'd met briefly at Christmas parties but didn't really know. The first 2 rows were reserved for immediate family, a designation that apparently no longer included me. "Victoria Sterling, as I live and breathe," said a voice behind me. I turned to find Mrs. Patricia Henley, my high school English teacher, resplendent in a purple dress that somehow made her look exactly the same as she had 25 years ago. "I've been following your career in the newspapers. 4 stars, can you believe it? I always knew you were destined for greatness." Her enthusiasm was genuine, untainted by the complicated family dynamics that had been wearing me down for weeks. We chatted about my service, about the changes in the military, about the book she was writing, about her 40 years of teaching. She asked intelligent questions about leadership and strategy, showing the same curiosity about my work that had made her such an effective teacher. "You know," she said, leaning closer, "I've had thousands of students over the years, but I've never been prouder of anyone than I am of you. You've accomplished something extraordinary." Her words hit me harder than they should have, a reminder of what genuine support felt like. Here was someone who had known me as a teenager, who remembered my potential when I was just a kid trying to figure out who I was supposed to become. She saw my achievements as something to celebrate, not as obstacles to overcome or problems to solve. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes and blinked them back quickly. This was neither the time nor the place for emotional displays. The string quartet began playing, and conversations gradually died down as guests turned their attention to the back of the garden. The groomsmen appeared first, walking in measured steps down the aisle. David looked nervous but happy, adjusting his tie and scanning the crowd with the expression of a man who couldn't quite believe his good fortune. His groomsmen were a mix of law school friends and college buddies, all clean-cut and successful-looking, the kind of men who'd never questioned their place in the world. Then came the bridesmaids, a parade of perfectly coordinated women in burgundy dresses that I'd helped select months ago. They moved with practiced grace, bouquets held at exactly the right angle, smiles bright and camera-ready. I recognized most of them. College friends, sorority sisters, women who'd shared Sophia's world of charity lunches and book clubs. They looked like they belonged together, like pieces of a puzzle that fit seamlessly into place. But it was the maid of honor who really caught my attention. Jennifer, Sophia's college roommate, walked down the aisle with the kind of confidence that came from knowing she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She wore the same burgundy dress I'd been fitted for, carried the same type of bouquet I'd helped select, and stood in the position I'd been promised when this whole journey began. The position I'd been gently but firmly removed from when it became clear that my presence would somehow diminish the occasion. I watched her take her place at the altar and felt something twist in my chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a deep sense of displacement. I'd been erased from my own sister's wedding, edited out like a scene that didn't fit the narrative. The rational part of my mind understood their reasoning. I was different. I stood out. I didn't blend seamlessly into their vision of perfection. But the emotional part of me, the part that had been hoping for acceptance my entire life, felt like I was watching my family choose someone else over me yet again. The music changed, and everyone rose as Sophia appeared at the back of the garden. She looked absolutely radiant, her dress catching the afternoon light like captured starlight. My father walked beside her, his face a mixture of pride and barely contained emotion. This was his little princess, his baby girl, the daughter who had fulfilled every expectation he'd ever had for her. She was beautiful, traditional, safe, everything I'd never been. As they passed my row, Sophia's eyes found mine for just a moment. She smiled, a genuine expression of love and gratitude that reminded me why I'd flown across the country to be here despite everything. This was still my sister, still the little girl I'd read bedtime stories to and helped with homework. The family politics and social positioning didn't change that fundamental connection, even if they'd complicated it beyond recognition. The ceremony itself was beautiful, traditional, exactly what Sophia had always dreamed of. The vows were personal but not too intimate, the music was classical but not too somber, the whole production was elegant but not too formal. It was a perfect wedding for a perfect couple, witnessed by a perfect gathering of family and friends. I listened to the words about love and commitment, about supporting each other through whatever challenges life might bring, and wondered if my family would ever truly support me through anything. When the officiant pronounced David and Sophia husband and wife, the garden erupted in applause. I clapped along with everyone else, genuinely happy for my sister's happiness, even as I felt increasingly like an outsider looking in. The recessional began, and I watched the wedding party file back down the aisle, all smiles and laughter and perfect coordination. They looked like they were walking into their future together, a cohesive unit bound by shared experiences and mutual understanding. The cocktail hour was held on the club's terrace, overlooking the 18th hole of the golf course. I nursed a glass of champagne and made polite conversation with distant relatives and family friends, answering the same questions about my career and my personal life that I'd been fielding for years. "How exciting that you're a general," they'd say, and then immediately follow up with, "But don't you want to settle down? Isn't it lonely being so far from family?" I developed a standard response that seemed to satisfy most people. The military has given me incredible opportunities to serve my country and lead amazing Marines. I'm grateful for every experience. It was true, if incomplete. What I didn't mention was how isolating it felt to be surrounded by people who saw my life's work as a career phase, rather than a calling, who viewed my achievements as obstacles to overcome, rather than accomplishments to celebrate. My mother appeared at my elbow during a lull in conversation, looking spectacular in a mother-of-the-bride dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "Victoria, you look lovely," she said, though her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "Are you enjoying yourself? I know this isn't really your usual scene." There it was again, the assumption that I was somehow uncomfortable in normal social situations, that my military background had rendered me incapable of enjoying civilian celebrations. "It's a beautiful wedding," I replied carefully. "Sophia looks happy." My mother nodded, but I could see her mentally cataloging my response, filing it away as evidence of my inability to fully participate in family joy. "The photographer wants to take some family photos before dinner," she continued. "Just the immediate family, you understand. We'll do larger group shots later." Immediate family. The phrase hung between us like a challenge. I was with my immediate family when they needed money for the country club membership, when they wanted to brag about their daughter the general at dinner parties, when they needed someone to represent military service at patriotic events. But I wasn't an immediate family when it came to standing beside my sister on her wedding day, when it came to being included in the formal photographs that would sit on mantels for decades. "Of course," I said, "because what else could I say? I'll be around whenever you need me." She smiled and patted my arm, the same gesture she'd used when I was 8 years old and disappointed about missing a birthday party. It was meant to be comforting, but it felt condescending, like she was managing my emotions rather than acknowledging them. As she walked away, I caught sight of my reflection in the terrace windows. I looked exactly like what I was, a woman who had spent her entire adult life learning to stand alone, to find strength in solitude, to derive purpose from service rather than acceptance. My posture was straight, my expression composed, my bearing dignified. But I also looked like someone who had been carefully positioned at the edges of her own family, included but not integrated, welcomed but not embraced. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Soon they would call everyone inside for dinner, for toasts, for dancing. I would sit at a table with family friends, smile at appropriate moments and applaud when required. I would be present but not central, visible but not vital. And tomorrow, I would fly back to Camp Pendleton, back to a world where my presence mattered, where my voice carried weight, where my contributions were valued rather than managed. But tonight, I was just Victoria Sterling, the sister who didn't quite fit, the daughter who had chosen a different path, the woman who had somehow become a stranger at her own family celebration. The recognition I'd spent my entire life hoping for from them seemed further away than ever, despite everything I'd accomplished, despite every barrier I'd broken, despite every life I'd touched through my service. The champagne bubbled against my lips as I took another sip, watching the wedding party pose for photographs in the golden hour light. They looked like they belonged in a magazine, all coordinated colors and genuine smiles and effortless elegance. And I looked like exactly what I was, someone who had been carefully cropped out of the frame. The reception hall was a masterpiece of wedding design, all cream and gold with crystal chandeliers that caught the light like suspended stars. Round tables draped in ivory linens filled the space, each one topped with towering centerpieces of white roses and baby's breath. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the scene and trying to locate my assigned seat. The seating chart, displayed on an ornate easel near the entrance, was a work of art in itself. Elegant calligraphy on cream cardstock, organized by table number with military precision. I found my name at table 12, positioned near the back of the room with a collection of distant relatives and family friends I barely knew. The bride and groom's table sat prominently at the front, flanked by the wedding party tables where the bridesmaids and groomsmen would share stories and inside jokes throughout the evening. I'd helped plan this seating arrangement months ago, back when I was still the maid of honor, back when I would have been sitting at table 1 with the other important people in Sophia's life. My table mates were already seated when I arrived, a mix of my father's business associates and their wives, plus my great-aunt Millicent, who lived in a retirement community in Florida and only emerged for major family events. They looked up expectantly as I approached, clearly having been briefed on my identity and achievements. "You must be Victoria," said a woman with perfectly styled silver hair and diamonds that caught the chandelier light. "I'm Helen Crawford, your father's accountant. We've heard so much about you." The conversation that followed was polite but predictable. Questions about my service, compliments on my achievements, carefully worded inquiries about my personal life. Helen's husband, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes, had served in Vietnam and asked thoughtful questions about modern military leadership. But even his genuine interest felt different from the kind of recognition I craved from my own family, professional respect rather than personal acceptance. "It must be difficult," said Mrs. Peterson, another business wife, "being so far from family all the time. Do you ever think about retiring, starting a family of your own?" Her question was asked with the kind of concerned tone women of her generation used when discussing unmarried women over 40. As if my single status was a medical condition that required delicate handling. I gave my standard response about service and sacrifice, about the honor of leading Marines and the importance of national security. But as I spoke, I found myself watching the head table, where Sophia was laughing at something David's best man had said. Her face was radiant with happiness, glowing with the kind of joy that came from being exactly where she belonged, surrounded by people who celebrated her choices rather than questioning them. The best man stood to give his toast, tapping his champagne flute with a knife until the room fell silent. He was handsome in that generic way that successful men often were, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that had probably charmed its way through law school and into a corner office. His speech was witty and warm, full of stories about David's college years and predictions about their future happiness. The room laughed at appropriate moments, sighed at the romantic parts, and erupted in applause when he raised his glass in tribute. Then came the maid of honor's toast, delivered by Jennifer with the confidence of someone who had known Sophia since freshman year of college. She spoke about their friendship, about watching Sophia grow into the woman she'd become, about being honored to stand beside her on this special day. Her words were heartfelt and personal, full of specific memories and shared experiences. She talked about late-night conversations in their dorm room, about supporting each other through breakups and career changes, about the moment she knew David was the one, because he made Sophia laugh in a way no one else ever had. I sat there listening, my champagne untouched, thinking about the speech I'd written and discarded. My words had been different, more formal, more distant, full of observations about Sophia's character rather than intimate memories of our sisterhood. Because the truth was, I didn't have many intimate memories to share. I'd been absent for most of Sophia's important moments, deployed overseas or stationed at bases thousands of miles from home. I'd missed her college graduation, her first job, her early relationships. I'd been a peripheral figure in her life, checking in through phone calls and brief visits home. When Jennifer finished speaking, the room erupted in applause and tears. Sophia hugged her tightly, whispering something in her ear that made them both laugh. I watched this display of sisterly affection and felt something hollow expand in my chest. That should have been me up there, sharing memories and making toasts, standing beside my sister as she transitioned into this new chapter of her life. Instead, I was watching from the sidelines, literally and figuratively relegated to the back of the room. The dinner service began with military precision, servers appearing with perfectly plated meals and synchronized timing. The conversation at my table turned to local politics and business trends, safe topics that didn't require emotional investment. I participated when appropriate, asking polite questions and offering non-controversial opinions. But part of my attention remained fixed on the head table, where the wedding party was clearly having the time of their lives. Great Aunt Millicent, who had been quiet throughout most of the meal, suddenly turned to me with sharp eyes that belied her 87 years. "You know," she said in a voice that carried despite her age, "I was a Navy nurse during World War II, served on a hospital ship in the Pacific. Never got thanked for it, never got recognized for it, but I did it anyway because it was right." She paused to take a sip of water, her gnarled hands steady despite the tremor in her voice. "Your generation has it better. At least they give you medals now." I looked at her with new respect, realizing that this elderly woman in her floral dress and sensible shoes had probably seen more combat than most of the men in the room. "Thank you for your service," I said, and meant it. She waved off my gratitude with a dismissive gesture. "Don't thank me. Thank you. You've done something extraordinary, even if your family doesn't seem to understand it." Her words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. She'd been watching the same dynamics I'd been experiencing all evening. The careful positioning and gentle exclusion that had become my family's standard operating procedure. From her perspective as an outsider, it was obvious that I was being managed rather than celebrated, tolerated rather than embraced. The dancing began after dinner, with David and Sophia taking the floor for their first dance as husband and wife. They moved together with practiced grace, having clearly taken lessons to prepare for this moment. The photographer circled them like a satellite, capturing every angle of their happiness for posterity. The wedding party joined them for the second song, couples pairing off in coordinated elegance. I watched from my seat, remembering the dance lessons I'd taken in college, the formal military balls where I'd learned to waltz and foxtrot with equal precision. My father appeared at my elbow as the music swelled, looking uncomfortable in his formal attire. "Victoria, would you like to dance?" His offer was polite but dutiful, the kind of gesture a father makes because protocol demands it, rather than because he wants to. I accepted because refusing would have created more awkwardness than participating. We moved onto the dance floor with the careful formality of two people who had never quite figured out how to be comfortable with each other. He led competently, his steps precise, and measured, but there was no warmth in the interaction. We were performing the role of father and daughter rather than actually connecting as human beings. "It's a beautiful wedding," I said, trying to fill the silence. He nodded, his attention focused on not stepping on my feet. "Sophia looks happy," I continued. "David seems like a good man." Another nod, another careful turn around the dance floor. We were having the kind of conversation strangers might have, polite and surface level, devoid of any real meaning. "Your mother put a lot of work into this," he said finally. "She wanted everything to be perfect." The emphasis on perfect felt pointed, as if he was explaining why certain compromises had been necessary, why certain people had been repositioned to maintain the overall aesthetic, why certain daughters had been moved from center stage to background support. The song ended, and he walked me back to my table with the same dutiful politeness he'd shown throughout the evening. No hug, no moment of genuine connection, just a father fulfilling his obligations to his daughter at her sister's wedding. I sat back down and watched him return to the head table, where he was immediately pulled into animated conversation with David's parents. The evening continued with typical wedding activities: the bouquet toss, the garter removal, the anniversary dance where married couples were gradually eliminated until only the longest married pair remained. I participated when appropriate, applauded when expected, and smiled when cameras pointed in my direction. But I felt like I was watching the proceedings from behind glass, present but somehow separate from the joy surrounding me. During a lull in the activities, I stepped outside onto the terrace for some air. The October night was crisp and clear, with stars visible despite the ambient light from the city. I stood alone in the darkness, listening to the muffled sounds of celebration from inside, and tried to process the complicated emotions churning in my chest. "General Sterling?" The voice behind me was unfamiliar, with a slight accent I couldn't immediately place. I turned to find a man in his 70s, distinguished-looking with silver hair and kind eyes. He was wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo and standing at attention in a way that suggested military training. "I'm Colonel James Chen, retired Army, David's father." I straightened instinctively, recognizing the bearing of a fellow officer. "Colonel Chen, it's a pleasure to meet you. You have a wonderful son." He smiled, but there was something in his expression that suggested this wasn't just a casual introduction. "I've been watching you all evening," he said quietly, "and I have to say I'm troubled by what I've observed." His words caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on managing my own emotions that I hadn't considered how my family's treatment of me might appear to outsiders. "I'm not sure what you mean," I said carefully. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "I've been in the military for 30 years, General. I know what leadership looks like, what sacrifice means, what it costs to serve at the highest levels. And I know disrespect when I see it." The conversation that followed would change everything about my evening, about my relationship with my family, about my understanding of my own worth. But in that moment, standing on the terrace with this stranger who somehow saw me more clearly than my own relatives, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The possibility that someone, somewhere, understood exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished. Colonel Chen's words were about to transform my entire understanding of this evening, of my place in my family, of the recognition I'd been seeking my whole life. But first, he needed to tell me exactly what he'd been observing, and why it had compelled him to seek me out in the darkness. Colonel Chen stepped closer, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades making difficult decisions. "General Sterling, I need to tell you something that might be uncomfortable to hear, but as a fellow officer, I feel it's my duty." He paused, looking back through the glass doors at the celebration inside. "I've been watching your family treat you like an inconvenience all evening, like your presence here is something to be managed rather than celebrated." His words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they confirmed what I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. "I'm not sure I understand," I said, though of course I understood perfectly. He shook his head, his expression a mixture of frustration and genuine concern. "General, I've spent my entire adult life in the military. I know what it means to sacrifice everything for your country, to put service before self, to earn respect through competence and dedication. And I know what it looks like when that sacrifice isn't valued by the people who should value it most." The October wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the perfectly manicured garden below us. Inside, I could hear the DJ announcing the cake cutting, the crowd gathering around the elaborate three-tiered creation that had required its own consultation meeting to design. "My family is proud of me," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "They just don't always understand the military world." Colonel Chen made a sound that might have been a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Pride and understanding are different things, General. What I saw tonight was a family that has systematically excluded you from meaningful participation in this celebration. You're sitting at a table with strangers while your sister's college friends occupy the positions of honor. You're treated like a guest at your own sister's wedding." He turned to face me directly, his expression intense. "Tell me, were you supposed to be the maid of honor?" The question hung in the air between us, and I found myself unable to answer immediately. The truth was too painful, too embarrassing, too revealing of just how little my family actually valued my presence in their lives. "Yes," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I was, until they decided I didn't fit the aesthetic they were going for." His face darkened, and I saw something flash in his eyes that reminded me of every commanding officer I'd ever served under when faced with an injustice. "They demoted you from maid of honor because you didn't fit their aesthetic?" He emphasized the last word like it was something distasteful. "General, you're a 4-star general in the United States Marine Corps. You've commanded thousands of Marines, made decisions that affected national security, earned the Medal of Honor in combat. And your family is worried about aesthetics?" Put that way, the absurdity of the situation became crystal clear. I'd been allowing myself to be diminished by people who had never accomplished a fraction of what I had, who had never put their lives on the line for anything more significant than a quarterly profit report. "They want me to be someone I'm not," I said, and felt something shift inside me as I spoke the words. "They want me to apologize for being strong, for being successful, for choosing service over traditional expectations." Colonel Chen nodded, his expression softening slightly. "My son David is a good man, but he's lived a privileged life. He's never had to prove himself the way you have, never had to earn respect from people who doubted his right to be there. Neither has your sister, for that matter. They've had the luxury of following conventional paths, of meeting expectations rather than exceeding them." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "That doesn't make them bad people, but it does mean they can't comprehend what you've achieved." I thought about all the times I'd tried to explain my work to my family, the glazed looks when I talked about strategic planning or troop movements, the way conversations always shifted to more comfortable topics like when I was going to settle down or why I couldn't just take a desk job closer to home. I keep hoping they'll see me, I said, surprised by the vulnerability in my own voice. Really see me, not just the uniform or the rank, but who I am and what I've accomplished. They can't see you, Colonel Chen said gently, because seeing you would require them to acknowledge that their definition of success is limited. That there are ways to live a meaningful life that don't involve marriage and children and conventional happiness. Your existence challenges their worldview, so they've chosen to minimize you rather than expand their understanding. The truth of his words settled over me like a weight. I'd been seeking validation from people who were fundamentally incapable of providing it. Not because they were cruel, but because they were limited. They'd created a narrow definition of what a woman should be, what a daughter should accomplish, what success should look like. And instead of questioning that definition when faced with evidence of its inadequacy, they'd chosen to question me. I earned the Medal of Honor, I said, and this time my voice was stronger. I've led Marines in combat. I've been trusted with classified information that could affect the security of our nation. I've built my life around service to something bigger than myself. I looked at him directly, feeling something straighten in my spine. Why isn't that enough for them? Because it's too much for them, he replied without hesitation. Your achievements make them uncomfortable because they highlight the limitations of their own choices. It's easier to treat you as the family member who never quite figured out how to be normal than to acknowledge that maybe normal isn't the highest aspiration a person can have. Inside, the music changed to something slower, more romantic. Through the glass doors, I could see couples swaying together on the dance floor, lost in their own private celebrations. My parents were dancing, looking like the successful, respectable couple they'd always been. Sophia and David moved past them, radiant with happiness, and surrounded by friends who celebrated their joy without reservation. I don't want to be bitter, I said, though I could feel bitterness taking root in my chest like a persistent weed. She's my sister. I love her. I want her to be happy. Colonel Chen nodded, understanding immediately. Love doesn't require you to diminish yourself, General. You can love your sister and still refuse to accept being treated as less than you are. The insight was simple but profound. I'd been so focused on maintaining family harmony that I'd forgotten I had the right to expect respect, to demand recognition, to refuse to be marginalized by people who claimed to love me. What would you do? I asked him, genuinely curious about his perspective. He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I'd remember who I am, he said finally. I'd remember what I've accomplished, what I've sacrificed, what I've earned. And I'd stop apologizing for being extraordinary just because other people are comfortable with ordinary. He gestured toward the celebration inside. This is a beautiful wedding, and your sister deserves to be happy. But that doesn't mean you have to pretend you're less than you are to make everyone else comfortable. His words sparked something in me that had been dormant for too long, a sense of my own worth that didn't depend on other people's approval. I'd spent so many years trying to fit into my family's expectations that I'd forgotten I had the right to expect them to rise to meet mine. I think I've been waiting for permission, I said, the realization hitting me like a revelation. Permission to be proud of myself, to demand respect, to refuse to be diminished. General, Colonel Chen said with a smile that held decades of hard-won wisdom, you don't need anyone's permission to be exactly who you are. You've already proven your worth to the people who matter, your Marines, your country, your fellow officers. The only person whose approval you need is your own. The music inside swelled to a crescendo, and I could hear laughter and applause echoing from the reception hall. My family was celebrating without me, just as they'd been doing in various ways my entire life, but for the first time I didn't feel the familiar ache of exclusion. Instead, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the solid, unshakable knowledge of my own value. Thank you, I said to Colonel Chen, meaning it more than I'd meant any words in a long time, for seeing me, for saying what needed to be said. He nodded, his expression warm with understanding. It's the least one officer can do for another. We have to look out for each other, especially when no one else will. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. As he spoke, I made a decision that would change everything about the rest of my evening. I was done apologizing for being who I was. Done shrinking to make others comfortable. Done accepting less than I deserved from people who should have been celebrating me instead of managing me. The time had come to stop waiting for recognition and start demanding it. Colonel Chen and I stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the celebration through the glass doors. The cake cutting had concluded, and guests were mingling freely, champagne flutes in hand, their laughter creating a warm buzz of contentment. But my perspective had shifted completely in the space of our conversation. What had seemed like a perfect family celebration now looked different. I could see the careful choreography that had placed me at the margins, the subtle ways I'd been edited out of the important moments. "There's something else you should know," Colonel Chen said quietly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "I wasn't planning to attend this wedding initially. David invited me, of course, but I've been dealing with some health issues and wasn't sure I'd be up for a formal event." He paused, adjusting his cufflinks with the precise movements of someone accustomed to military protocol. But when he mentioned that his new sister-in-law was General Victoria Sterling, I knew I had to be here. I looked at him with surprise, not understanding the connection. "You knew about me?" He nodded, his expression grave. "General, 3 years ago my nephew Marcus was serving under your command in Afghanistan. Lieutenant Marcus Chen, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines. He was killed in an IED explosion during a patrol mission in Helmand Province." The name hit me like a physical blow. I remembered Marcus, bright, dedicated, the kind of young officer who reminded me why I'd chosen to serve. He'd been killed on a routine patrol that had gone wrong, one of those senseless losses that kept me awake at night, long after the casualty reports had been filed. "Lieutenant Chen," I said softly, the memory flooding back. "He was a good Marine. I'm sorry for your loss." Colonel Chen's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "He wrote to me about you, General. In his letters home, he talked about how you remembered every Marine's name, how you visited the wounded in the field hospital, how you made decisions that saved lives even when they cost you politically. He said you were the kind of leader who made other people want to be better." I felt my throat tighten, remembering the young lieutenant who had always volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, who had worried more about his Marines than himself. "He was special," I said, meaning every word. "He had the kind of moral courage that can't be taught. I was proud to serve with him." "After he died," Colonel Chen continued, "I followed your career more closely. I read about your promotion to 4-star general, about the changes you implemented in training protocols, about the way you advocated for veteran mental health services. Marcus would have been proud to see how you continued to lead, how you used your position to make things better for the people who served under you." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a man who had never met me before tonight, who knew more about my professional accomplishments and their impact than my own family. While my parents questioned whether my career was worth the personal sacrifices, while my siblings treated my service as an interesting hobby, this stranger understood that my work had meaning beyond the uniforms and ceremonies. "When I walked into this reception tonight," he said, "I expected to see you being celebrated, honored, recognized for everything you've achieved. Instead, I watched your family treat you like an awkward obligation. I saw you sitting at a table with strangers while your sister's college friends occupied the positions of honor. I watched your parents introduce you to people as if your rank was something to be politely overlooked rather than proudly proclaimed." His words crystallized something that had been bothering me all evening. My family had spent years learning to minimize my achievements in social settings, to present them as interesting facts rather than extraordinary accomplishments. They'd trained themselves to deflect attention away from my service, to redirect conversations toward more comfortable topics. They'd become experts at managing my presence so it wouldn't overshadow their preferred narrative. "I've been making excuses for them," I said, the admission painful but necessary. "Telling myself they don't understand military culture, that they're just trying to help me fit in, that they love me in their own way. But the truth is, they're embarrassed by who I am. They wish I'd chosen a different path, a more conventional life, something they could understand and control." Colonel Chen nodded, his expression both sympathetic and determined. "General, I've been in the military for 30 years. I've seen how families react to service members, and I can tell you that healthy families find ways to support and celebrate their loved ones' achievements, even when they don't fully understand them. They don't systematically exclude them from important moments or treat their accomplishments as problems to be solved. The truth of his words settled over me like armor, protective and strengthening. I'd been so focused on trying to fit into their definition of family that I'd forgotten I had the right to expect them to expand their definition to include me. I think I've been afraid, I admitted, afraid that if I demanded respect, if I refused to be diminished, they'd reject me completely. At least this way, I still have some connection to them. But what kind of connection is it, really? He asked gently. If you have to pretend to be someone else to maintain it, if you have to apologize for your strengths and hide your achievements, is that actually love? Or is it just convenience for them and suffering for you? His question hung in the air between us, forcing me to confront something I'd been avoiding for years. My relationship with my family wasn't built on mutual respect and understanding. It was built on my willingness to make myself smaller so they could feel more comfortable. I'd been sacrificing my dignity for their convenience, accepting crumbs of affection instead of demanding the full meal of recognition I deserved. Marcus used to say something in his letters, Colonel Chen continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing a treasured memory. He said you taught him that respect isn't something you ask for. It's something you command through your actions and then refuse to accept anything less than. He said you never begged for recognition, never apologized for being competent, never made yourself smaller to make other people comfortable. The words hit me with the force of revelation. I'd been teaching those lessons to young Marines for decades, but I'd forgotten to apply them to my own life. In my professional world, I commanded respect through competence and integrity. I made decisions with confidence and stood by them. I never apologized for being good at my job or for expecting others to meet high standards. But with my family, I'd been operating from a position of weakness, constantly seeking approval and accepting whatever scraps of affection they offered. I need to remember who I am, I said, feeling something shift in my chest, a straightening of my spine that had nothing to do with military bearing and everything to do with personal dignity. I need to stop apologizing for being extraordinary and start expecting the people who claim to love me to celebrate it. Colonel Chen smiled, and I saw pride in his expression, the kind of pride I'd been hoping to see in my own father's eyes for 42 years. There's the general Marcus wrote about, he said, the leader who knows her worth and doesn't accept anything less than what she deserves. Inside, the music changed to something more upbeat, and I could see the dance floor filling with guests of all ages. My parents were talking animatedly with David's extended family, probably sharing stories about the wedding planning and the challenges of coordinating such a large event. They looked happy, content, completely unaware that their treatment of me had been noticed and found wanting by someone whose opinion actually mattered. I think it's time I went back inside, I said, but my tone was different now, stronger, more purposeful. I think it's time I reminded my family exactly who they're dealing with. Colonel Chen nodded approvingly. Good. And General? Remember that you don't need their permission to be proud of yourself. You've already earned the right to hold your head high. As I prepared to walk back into the reception, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to my family. Power. Not the kind of power that comes from rank or position, but the kind that comes from knowing your worth and refusing to accept anything less than what you deserve. I was done being managed, done being marginalized, done being treated like an inconvenience at my own sister's wedding. The recognition I'd been seeking my whole life was about to come from an unexpected source. But first, I needed to walk back into that room as the person I actually was. Not the diminished version my family preferred, but the full-strength, unapologetic, 4-star general who had earned every bit of respect she commanded. Colonel Chen was right. It was time to stop asking for recognition and start demanding it. I walked back into the reception hall with my shoulders squared and my head high, feeling like I was entering a combat zone where the enemy was my own family's diminished expectations. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, guests mingling freely as the evening reached its peak energy. But now I saw everything differently. The careful seating arrangements that had placed me at the periphery, the way conversations quieted when I approached, the polite but distant smiles that greeted me wherever I went. Colonel Chen followed a few steps behind me, his presence both comforting and empowering. I could feel his eyes on me as I navigated through the crowd, no longer trying to blend in or make myself smaller. Instead, I moved with the confidence I'd earned through decades of military service, the bearing that had commanded respect in boardrooms and battlefields around the world. My mother appeared at my elbow almost immediately, her radar finely tuned to detect any potential disruption to her perfectly orchestrated evening. "Victoria, there you are. I was wondering where you'd gone." Her tone was light, but I could hear the underlying concern that I might have been causing problems somewhere beyond her sight. "I was just getting some air," I replied, my voice steady and controlled. "Having a conversation with Colonel Chen about military service." She glanced toward David's father with an expression I couldn't quite read, part curiosity, part wariness. "Oh, how nice. I hope you weren't boring him with too many war stories." The casual dismissal of my experiences, the assumption that my service record was something tedious rather than something worthy of respect, hit me differently than it had before. Instead of feeling diminished, I felt a surge of anger so pure it was almost liberating. "Actually," I said, my voice carrying the authority I'd learned to project in command situations, "Colonel Chen was telling me about his nephew, Lieutenant Marcus Chen, who served under my command in Afghanistan. He was killed in action 3 years ago, a good Marine who died serving his country." My mother's face went pale, clearly realizing she'd misjudged the conversation entirely. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." "There's a lot you don't realize," I said quietly, but with enough edge that she understood this wasn't going to be another moment where I quietly absorbed her thoughtless comments and moved on. "About my service, about what I've accomplished, about the Marines who've trusted me with their lives." She opened her mouth to respond, but I continued before she could speak. "I've spent my entire adult life serving something bigger than myself, and I'm tired of apologizing for it." The exchange had attracted the attention of nearby guests, who were pretending to focus on their own conversations while clearly listening to ours. I could see heads turning slightly, eyes watching discreetly as they sensed the tension building between us. My mother's social instincts kicked in, and she tried to de-escalate with a forced smile and a gentle touch on my arm. "Of course, sweetheart, we're all very proud of you. You know that." But her words felt hollow, perfunctory, the kind of thing she said to manage the situation rather than express genuine sentiment. "Are you?" I asked, meeting her eyes directly. "Are you actually proud of me, or are you just proud that you can tell people you have a daughter who's a general?" The question hung in the air between us, and I saw something flicker across her face, surprise, perhaps, or recognition that I was no longer willing to accept her standard deflections. Before she could answer, the DJ's voice boomed across the room, announcing that it was time for the father-daughter dance. My mother's relief was palpable as she gestured toward the dance floor where my father was already waiting for Sophia. I watched as they took their positions, the photographer circling them to capture every moment of their connection. The song was something classic and sentimental, the kind of music that was designed to make everyone think about family bonds and unconditional love. Sophia looked radiant in her father's arms, spinning gracefully as guests gathered around to watch this traditional moment of celebration. But as I stood there observing this picture-perfect scene, I couldn't help but notice how different their relationship was from mine with our father. He looked at Sophia with genuine pride and affection, his face soft with emotion as he guided her through the dance. When had he ever looked at me that way? When had he ever shown that kind of unguarded happiness about my achievements? The dance ended to enthusiastic applause, and the DJ invited other fathers and daughters to join them on the floor. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the anticipation of another awkward interaction, where my father would dutifully fulfill his obligations while somehow making it clear that he was just going through the motions. But as I started to move toward him, something unexpected happened. Colonel Chen stepped forward, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the reception. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but commanding enough to draw attention from across the room. "Before we continue with the dancing, I'd like to say something." The DJ lowered the music, and conversations gradually died down as guests turned to face him. I felt a surge of panic, unsure of what he was planning but sensing that whatever came next would be significant. "Ladies and gentlemen," he continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard, "I don't usually speak at weddings, but tonight I feel compelled to address something that's been troubling me all evening." The room was completely silent now, everyone focused on this distinguished older gentleman who had somehow commandeered their attention. I could see my parents exchanging concerned glances, clearly wondering what this unexpected interruption might bring. "I've been watching the way this family treats one of their own," he said, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling on me. "And I have to say, as a fellow military officer, I'm disappointed. Deeply disappointed." The words hit the room like a physical force, and I could see guests shifting uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond to this sudden breach of wedding etiquette. My father stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "I'm sorry, but I don't think this is the appropriate time or place for," but Colonel Chen held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence with the kind of authority that came from decades of military command. "Sir, with respect, I think this is exactly the right time and place. Because what I've witnessed tonight is a family that has systematically excluded and diminished one of the most remarkable women I've ever had the privilege to meet." The room was electric with tension now, guests frozen in place as they watched this unexpected drama unfold. I could see Sophia's face, pale with shock and confusion, and David's expression of mortification as his father disrupted his wedding reception. But I also saw something else. Other guests leaning forward, suddenly interested in what this man had to say about me. "You see," Colonel Chen continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I know who General Victoria Sterling is. I know what she's accomplished, what she's sacrificed, what she's earned through decades of exemplary service to our country. And I know that any family would be honored to have her as their daughter, their sister, their blood." He turned to look directly at me, and I saw tears in his eyes as he spoke his next words with the solemnity of someone delivering a eulogy. "General Sterling, 3 years ago, you held my nephew Marcus in your arms as he died in Afghanistan. You made sure he knew he was loved, that his sacrifice mattered, that he would be remembered. You've done that for countless Marines over the years, and you've never asked for recognition or thanks." The room was utterly silent now, the weight of his words settling over everyone like a blanket. I felt my own eyes filling with tears, remembering Marcus and so many others who had trusted me with their final moments. But Colonel Chen wasn't finished. "Tonight I've watched your family treat you like an inconvenience, like your presence here is something to be managed rather than celebrated. I've seen you relegated to the back of the room, excluded from positions of honor, dismissed when you try to share your experiences." His voice was rising now, carrying the force of righteous anger. "And I will not stand by and watch that happen to someone who has given everything in service to our nation." Then, in a moment that would be seared into my memory forever, Colonel Chen came to attention and saluted me with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime honoring military tradition. "General Victoria Sterling," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "4-star general, Medal of Honor recipient, leader of Marines. Ma'am, it is my honor to serve in your presence." The salute hung in the air like a challenge, demanding that everyone in the room acknowledge what they had been trying to ignore all evening. I felt something break open in my chest. Not sadness, but a fierce, clean pride that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. This was recognition. This was respect. This was what I had been seeking my whole life, delivered by a stranger who understood my worth better than my own family. The silence that followed Colonel Chen's salute was deafening. 300 wedding guests stood frozen in place, champagne glasses suspended halfway to lips, conversations cut off mid-sentence, all eyes fixed on the tableau unfolding before them. I felt the weight of their stares, the collective intake of breath as they processed what they'd just witnessed. A formal military salute delivered with ceremony and reverence in the middle of a wedding reception. My training kicked in automatically. When a fellow officer salutes, you return the gesture with equal precision and dignity. I came to attention, my spine straightening to its full height, my shoulders squaring with the bearing I'd carried through decades of service. My right hand rose in a crisp salute, held for the precise 3 seconds required by military protocol, then dropped to my side with the snap of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times. "Colonel Chen," I said, my voice carrying across the silent room with the authority I'd learned to project in command situations. "The honor is mine, sir. Thank you for your service, and thank you for remembering Lieutenant Marcus Chen. He was a Marine's Marine, and his sacrifice will not be forgotten." The formality of the exchange, the military precision of our interaction, created a stark contrast to the wedding celebration surrounding us. Here, in the middle of flowers and champagne and celebration, 2 soldiers had found each other and shared a moment of recognition that transcended the social awkwardness of family dynamics. It was beautiful and powerful and completely authentic in a way that nothing else about this evening had been. Then something extraordinary happened. From the back of the room, I heard the scraping of a chair as someone stood up. An elderly man in a navy blue suit, his posture unmistakably military despite his age, had risen to his feet. He looked directly at me and brought his hand to his forehead in a perfect salute. "General," he said in a voice that carried decades of command experience. "Brigadier General Robert Hayes, Army, retired. It's an honor, ma'am." I returned his salute with equal precision, feeling something electric begin to course through the room. Before I could fully process what was happening, another guest stood up. A woman in her 60s, wearing an elegant purple dress, her bearing suggesting military service despite her civilian attire. "Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Air Force, retired," she announced, her salute crisp and professional. "General Sterling, thank you for your service." What followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. One by one, military personnel throughout the room began to stand and identify themselves. Major Thompson from the Marines, Captain Rodriguez from the Navy, Sergeant First Class Williams from the Army. Some were active duty, others retired, but all of them rose to acknowledge my presence with the respect that military tradition demanded. The civilians watched in stunned silence as nearly 24 men and women in formal attire transformed themselves into a military formation through nothing more than shared recognition of service and sacrifice. The salutes were perfect, the bearing impeccable, the reverence genuine. These were people who understood what 4 stars meant, who knew the weight of command responsibility, who recognized the significance of the Medal of Honor. My parents stood frozen near the head table, their faces pale with shock and something that might have been embarrassment. This was their daughter, their blood, receiving the kind of recognition they'd never offered her. They were watching strangers honor her achievements while they'd spent the evening trying to minimize them. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Sophia had moved closer to David, clinging to his arm with an expression of confusion and distress. This was supposed to be her day, her moment of celebration, and instead it had become a tribute to her sister's accomplishments. I could see the conflict in her face. Part of her was probably proud, but another part was clearly struggling with the attention being redirected away from her wedding. Colonel Chen waited until the last salute had been returned before speaking again. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing large groups. "I apologize for interrupting this beautiful celebration, but I could not sit silently while a hero was treated as anything less than what she is." He gestured toward me with obvious pride. "General Sterling has dedicated her life to protecting the freedoms we all enjoy. She has led Marines in combat, made decisions that saved countless lives, and earned the highest honors our nation can bestow." The room was still silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the shocked quiet of people witnessing an unexpected disruption, but the reverent hush of people beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd been witnessing all evening. They were seeing me differently now, not as the awkward family member who didn't quite fit in, but as someone whose achievements commanded respect. "I've been watching this family all evening," Colonel Chen continued, his words cutting through the silence like a blade, "and I've been troubled by what I've observed. General Sterling has been relegated to the back of the room, excluded from positions of honor, treated as if her presence here is something to be managed rather than celebrated." His voice grew stronger with each word. "This is not how we treat our heroes, This is not how we honor those who have sacrificed everything for our nation." My father stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Now see here," he began, but Colonel Chen held up a hand to stop him. "Sir, with respect, I've seen enough. Your daughter has achieved something extraordinary. She has risen to the highest levels of military leadership, earned the respect of her peers, and dedicated her life to serving something bigger than herself. And instead of celebrating her, you've spent this evening trying to diminish her." The accuracy of his assessment hit like a physical blow. Every word was true, every observation was correct. My family had spent years trying to make me smaller, to fit me into their limited understanding of what a woman should be and do. They'd been embarrassed by my success, uncomfortable with my achievements, and determined to minimize my impact on their carefully constructed world. "I don't think you understand," my mother said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Victoria is our daughter. We love her. We're proud of her. We've always supported her choices." But her words rang hollow in the face of what everyone had just witnessed. The contrast between her claims and the reality of how they'd treated me was too stark to ignore. Colonel Chen's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Ma'am, I'm sure you love your daughter. But love without respect is not enough. Support without recognition is not enough. Your daughter has earned the right to be celebrated, not managed. She has earned the right to be honored, not hidden." The other military personnel in the room began to move closer, creating an informal formation around me. It wasn't planned or coordinated, but it was instinctive. Soldiers protecting one of their own, officers showing solidarity with a fellow leader. Their presence was both comforting and empowering, a reminder that I belonged somewhere, that my achievements were valued by people who understood their significance. "General Sterling," said Brigadier General Hayes, his voice carrying across the room with the authority of someone who had spent decades in command, "would you honor us by sharing a few words? I think everyone here would benefit from hearing about your service, your experiences, your perspective on what it means to lead." The request hung in the air like a challenge. My family had spent the evening trying to keep me quiet, to minimize my presence, to avoid drawing attention to my achievements. Now I was being invited to speak, to share my story, to claim the recognition I'd been denied. I looked across the room at my parents, at Sophia, at the wedding guests, who had suddenly become an audience for something much more significant than a family celebration. For the first time all evening, I had the floor. I had the attention. I had the opportunity to be seen and heard as the person I actually was, not the diminished version my family preferred. The question was, what would I do with it? The moment stretched out, pregnant with possibility. Everyone was waiting to see how I would respond, whether I would shrink back into the shadows or step forward into the light. I thought about Marcus Chen, about all the Marines who had trusted me with their lives, about the decades of service that had brought me to this moment. Then I began to speak, my voice carrying the authority and confidence that had been earned through years of leadership, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to duty. I took a deep breath and stepped forward into the space that had formed around me, the circle of military personnel creating a natural stage in the center of the reception hall. The weight of 300 pairs of eyes settled on me, but for the first time all evening, I didn't feel diminished by the attention. Instead, I felt the familiar surge of confidence that came from knowing exactly who I was and what I represented. "Thank you, Colonel Chen," I began, my voice carrying the projection I'd learned from years of addressing large formations. "And thank you to all the service members who have honored me with their recognition tonight. Your salutes mean more to me than you'll ever know." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the room, taking in the faces of people who had suddenly become intensely interested in what I had to say. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," I continued, my tone measured and controlled. "I came here to celebrate my sister's wedding, to share in her happiness, to participate in this important milestone in her life. But I find myself in the unexpected position of having to explain who I am to people who should already know." The words carried an edge that was impossible to miss, and I saw several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. My name is General Victoria Sterling, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. I've served in the United States Marine Corps for 22 years. I've been deployed to combat zones 4 times, commanded units ranging from platoons to entire divisions, and been trusted with the lives of thousands of Marines. I've made decisions that affected national security, participated in operations that saved American lives, and earned decorations that represent the highest honor our nation can bestow. The room was absolutely silent now, the kind of focused attention that came from people realizing they were witnessing something significant. I could see my parents' faces in the crowd, pale and strained, probably hoping I would wrap up quickly and return to my designated place in the background. But I was just getting started. 3 years ago, I held a young Marine named Marcus Chen in my arms as he died from injuries sustained in an IED explosion in Afghanistan, I continued, my voice carrying the weight of that memory. He was 23 years old, the same age I was when I first deployed to Iraq. He died serving his country, protecting the freedom that allows us to gather here tonight in safety and celebration. I turned to look directly at Colonel Chen, whose eyes were bright with unshed tears. Marcus was one of hundreds of Marines I've had the privilege to lead, to serve alongside, to learn from. They taught me what leadership really means. Not giving orders from behind a desk, but making decisions that you have to live with, that affect real people with real families who are counting on you to bring them home. The military personnel in the room understood immediately. I could see it in their faces, the recognition of shared experience, the knowledge of what it meant to carry that kind of responsibility. But I also saw something else in the faces of the civilian guests. A dawning understanding that they were hearing about a world they'd never imagined, about sacrifices they'd never been asked to make. I've been asked many times over the years why I chose this path, I said, my voice taking on a more personal tone. Why I gave up the conventional life that was expected of me. Why I chose service over security. Why I prioritized duty over personal comfort. The answer is simple. Because someone has to. Because freedom isn't free. And democracy isn't guaranteed, and the values we hold dear don't protect themselves. I could feel the energy in the room shifting, the wedding guests becoming genuinely engaged with what I was saying. This wasn't just a military officer talking about abstract concepts. This was a woman explaining the choices that had defined her life, the sacrifices that had shaped her character, the purpose that had driven her for more than 2 decades. I've missed family gatherings because I was deployed overseas, I continued, my voice carrying a note of personal cost that was impossible to ignore. I've missed birthdays and holidays and important milestones because I was serving something bigger than myself. I've made the choice again and again to put the needs of my Marines and my country before my own comfort and convenience. The words hung in the air, and I saw several guests glance toward my parents, probably wondering how they had responded to these sacrifices over the years. I didn't need to look at them to know the answer. They'd treated my deployments as inconveniences, my dedication as stubbornness, my service as a phase 1 would eventually outgrow. But here's what I want everyone in this room to understand, I said, my voice taking on the authority of command. I didn't make these choices because I had to. I made them because I wanted to, because I believe in something bigger than myself. Because I found purpose in service, because I discovered that the most meaningful life is one dedicated to protecting others. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over the room, then I continued with something I'd never said out loud before, a truth that had been building inside me for years. I've been apologizing for these choices my entire adult life, apologizing for missing family events, for choosing duty over convenience, for being someone who doesn't fit into conventional expectations. But I'm done apologizing. The declaration carried the force of a battle cry, and I saw several of the military personnel in the room straighten with recognition. This was what they'd been waiting to hear. Not just an explanation of my service, but a claim of my right to be proud of it. I'm proud of what I've accomplished, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I'm proud of the Marines I've led, the lives I've saved, the example I've set for young women who are told they can't or shouldn't pursue careers in combat arms. I'm proud of earning my rank through competence and dedication, not through connections or compromise. The room was electric with tension now, guests hanging on every word as I continued to speak truths that had been building inside me for decades. I could see my sister's face in the crowd, her expression a mixture of shock and something that might have been pride. This was a version of her sister she'd never seen before, not the woman who apologized for her strength, but the one who claimed it. I've been told many times that I'm too intense, too serious, too focused on my career, I said, my voice carrying a note of defiance that surprised even me. I've been told that my achievements are impressive, but that they don't make up for what I've supposedly sacrificed. Marriage, children, a conventional life. But I reject that premise entirely. I looked directly at my parents as I spoke my next words, wanting them to understand exactly what I was saying. I haven't sacrificed anything. I've chosen everything. I've chosen to serve, to lead, to dedicate my life to something that matters. And I refuse to apologize for those choices anymore. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted Colonel Chen's salute. This was the silence of people processing something profound, of wedding guests who had come expecting cake and champagne, but were instead witnessing something much more significant. A woman claiming her place in the world, refusing to be diminished, demanding the recognition she had earned. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, someone began to clap. Slowly, deliberately, with the kind of applause that signaled deep respect rather than polite approval. Others joined in, the sound building gradually until the entire room was applauding. Not just the military personnel, but the civilians, the family friends, the wedding guests who had suddenly understood they were in the presence of someone extraordinary. But I wasn't finished yet. I had more to say, more truths to speak, more ground to claim. The recognition I'd been seeking my whole life was finally within reach, and I was going to seize it with both hands. The applause gradually died down, but the energy in the room remained electric. I could feel the shift in how people were looking at me, not as the family member who didn't quite fit, but as someone commanding genuine respect. The recognition was intoxicating, but I knew I had more to say, more truths that needed to be spoken before this moment passed. I want to share something with you, I continued, my voice carrying the storytelling cadence I'd learned from briefing senior officials and foreign dignitaries. Last year, I was invited to speak at the Naval Academy graduation ceremony. 250 young officers, about to begin their careers in service to our nation. After my speech, a young woman approached me, Ensign Sarah Rodriguez, about to deploy to the Pacific Fleet. I paused, letting the image settle in everyone's minds. She told me that her parents had tried to discourage her from military service, that they'd worried about her safety, her future, her ability to have a normal life. But she said that hearing about my career, about the barriers I'd broken and the example I'd set, had given her the courage to pursue her dreams despite their concerns. The room was completely silent again, hanging on every word. I could see some of the younger women in the audience leaning forward, genuinely interested in hearing about this different kind of success story. 6 months later, I received a letter from Ensign Rodriguez. She was serving aboard the USS Roosevelt, leading a damage control team, and she'd just been selected for advanced training at the Naval War College. She wrote that she'd never felt more proud of her choices, more confident in her abilities, more certain that she was exactly where she belonged. I let that sink in for a moment, then continued with the point I really wanted to make. That young woman understood something that I'm still learning to embrace. That breaking barriers isn't just about personal achievement. It's about creating space for others to follow. About proving that there are many ways to live a meaningful life. About showing that strength and service are not incompatible with being a woman. My eyes found my parents in the crowd, and I spoke directly to them. I've spent my entire adult life trying to make you comfortable with my choices, trying to minimize my achievements so they wouldn't overshadow your expectations, trying to be smaller so you could feel bigger. But I realize now that I've been doing a disservice not just to myself, but to every young woman who might be watching, who might be wondering if she can choose a different path. My mother's face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. My father stood rigid beside her, his expression unreadable. But I could see something in their eyes, perhaps the beginning of understanding, or maybe just the recognition that their daughter was no longer the person they could manage and minimize. I've been told that my life is incomplete because I don't have a husband and children, I continued, my voice taking on a sharper edge. I've been asked repeatedly when I'm going to settle down, as if the life I've built is somehow temporary or insufficient. But I want to be clear about something. My life is not incomplete. It's different. It's unconventional. But it's complete in ways that matter to me. I gestured toward the military personnel scattered throughout the room. I have a family, thousands of Marines who have served under my command, who have trusted me with their lives, who have looked to me for leadership and guidance. I have children. Every young officer I've mentored, every enlisted Marine I've developed, every person who has become a better leader because of something I taught them. The words carried a passion that surprised even me. I hadn't realized how much I needed to say these things, how much I needed to claim the value of the life I'd chosen. I have love, the deep, abiding love that comes from serving something bigger than yourself, from dedicating your life to protecting others, from finding purpose in sacrifice and meaning in service. Colonel Chen was nodding approvingly, and I could see tears in the eyes of several other military personnel. They understood what I was saying because they'd lived it themselves. The unique fulfillment that came from military service, the bonds that formed in shared hardship, the pride that came from knowing you'd made a difference. But I've been hiding this truth from my own family, I continued, my voice growing stronger. I've been pretending that my achievements were somehow less valuable than traditional markers of success. I've been apologizing for being extraordinary when I should have been demanding that you recognize it, celebrate it, honor it. The room was so quiet I could hear the slight rustle of fabric as people shifted in their seats. This was clearly not what anyone had expected from a wedding reception. But it was riveting in its honesty and intensity. "Sophia," I said, turning to look directly at my sister, who was standing near the head table with David, her face a mixture of confusion and something that might have been pride. "I love you. I'm genuinely happy for you. You deserve all the joy and celebration of this beautiful wedding. But I can't pretend anymore that my absence from your wedding party doesn't hurt, that being relegated to the back of the room doesn't sting, that watching strangers receive more recognition than your own sister doesn't break my heart." Sophia's eyes filled with tears, and I saw David put his arm around her protectively, but I also saw something else, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even regret. "I wanted to be your maid of honor," I continued, my voice gentle but firm. "Not because I needed the title, but because I wanted to stand beside you during the most important moment of your life. I wanted to be part of your story, not just a footnote in it." The honesty of the moment was almost overwhelming. I could feel the collective intake of breath from the wedding guests, the recognition that they were witnessing something profound and personal. But I wasn't finished yet. "I realize now that I've been waiting my entire life for recognition that was never going to come," I said, my voice taking on a note of hard-won wisdom. "I've been hoping that if I achieved enough, sacrificed enough, proved myself enough, my family would finally see me as I am and celebrate what I've accomplished. But that recognition doesn't come from other people, it comes from within." I straightened my shoulders, feeling the full weight of my rank and experience settle around me like armor. "I am General Victoria Sterling. I have earned every star on my collar, every ribbon on my chest, every bit of respect that comes with my position. I have led Marines in combat, saved lives through my decisions, and broken barriers that will make it easier for women who come after me." The words rang out with the force of a declaration, and I felt something shift inside me, a fundamental change in how I saw myself, how I claimed my space in the world. I don't need anyone's permission to be proud of these achievements. I don't need anyone's approval to recognize their value. I don't need anyone's validation to know that I have lived a life of purpose and meaning. The applause that followed was different from before, deeper, more sustained, more genuine. It was the kind of applause that recognized not just achievement, but courage. The courage to speak truth, to claim space, to refuse to be diminished by people who should have been celebrating me all along. But as the applause died down, I realized that the most important moment was still to come. Because recognition from strangers, no matter how genuine, couldn't fill the space that had been carved out by a lifetime of family rejection. The real test would be how my parents, my sister, my blood relatives would respond to this moment of truth. The ball was in their court now. I had spoken my truth, claimed my space, demanded the recognition I deserved. The question was, Would they finally see me as I was, or would they retreat further into their comfortable illusions about who I should be? The silence that followed my declaration stretched like a taut wire, charged with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that remained unspoken. I could feel the collective breath of 300 wedding guests as they waited to see how my family would respond to this moment of truth. The military personnel around me maintained their supportive formation, but I knew that ultimately, this was something I had to face alone. My father was the first to move. He stepped forward from the crowd, his face cycling through expressions I'd never seen before. Shock, recognition, something that might have been shame. His normally commanding presence seemed diminished as he approached me, and for the first time in my life, I saw him as something other than the unshakable patriarch who had defined my childhood. "Victoria," he said, his voice rough with emotion I'd never heard from him before. He stopped, looked around the room at the faces watching us, then back at me. "I had no idea that you felt, that we had—" He struggled for words, his usual confidence completely absent. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The apology hung in the air between us, unexpected and fragile. I could see the effort it cost him to say those words, the way his shoulders sagged as if he was carrying a weight he'd only just realized was there. But I also saw something else. The same man who had dismissed my achievements, who had made me feel like an inconvenience, who had never once looked at me with the pride I'd seen him show for my siblings. "You're sorry," I repeated, my voice carefully neutral. "For what, specifically?" The question wasn't cruel, but it was direct. I needed to know if he understood what he was apologizing for, if he truly grasped the depth of what had been happening all these years. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot like a child being called to account. For not recognizing what you'd accomplished, for not understanding how important your service was, for treating you like— He paused, searching for words. "For treating you like you were the problem when you were actually the solution." The words were more insightful than I'd expected from him, and I felt something soften in my chest. But I also felt the need to push deeper, to make sure this wasn't just a momentary response to public embarrassment. "Dad, I've been trying to earn your respect for 42 years. I have achieved things that should have made you proud, and instead, you've acted like they were obstacles to overcome. Why?" The question seemed to hit him physically, and I saw him flinch. Around us, the room remained silent, but I could feel the tension of people witnessing a deeply personal reckoning. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I think I was afraid of you, afraid of what you represented. You were so strong, so determined, so unlike what I thought daughters were supposed to be. And instead of celebrating that, I tried to make you smaller." The honesty of his admission was stunning. I'd expected deflection, justification, maybe even anger. But this raw acknowledgement of his own fear, his own limitations, was something I'd never heard from him before. "You were afraid of me?" I asked, genuinely surprised. "I'm your daughter. I was trying to make you proud." "You did make me proud," he said, and there were tears in his eyes now. "Every promotion, every medal, every time your name appeared in the newspaper. I would cut out the articles, save them, show them to people at work, but I didn't know how to tell you that. I didn't know how to bridge the gap between who you were and who I thought you should be." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. He had been proud of me, had been following my career, had been collecting evidence of my achievements. But he'd never been able to express that pride directly, had never been able to make me feel valued for who I was, rather than criticized for who I wasn't. My mother stepped forward then, her face streaked with tears and her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. "Victoria, I failed you," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "I failed you, as a mother, as a woman, as a person who should have been celebrating your strength instead of trying to diminish it." I looked at her, this woman, who had spent my entire life trying to make me softer, more conventional, more acceptable. The woman who had worried about my appearance at social events, who had questioned my choices, who had treated my achievements like character flaws to be managed. "Mom," I said quietly, "you've spent 42 years trying to make me into someone I'm not. Why?" She took a shuddering breath, wiping tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. Because I was scared, she said simply, scared of what the world would do to a woman who was too strong, too independent, too unwilling to compromise. I thought if I could make you softer, more conventional, you'd be safer, you'd be happier, you'd fit in better. The words revealed a depth of misunderstanding that took my breath away. Mom, I was never meant to fit in. I was meant to stand out, to break barriers, to show other women that there were different ways to live a meaningful life. By trying to make me smaller, you were trying to destroy the very thing that made me special. She nodded through her tears, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I know that now. I've known it for years, but I didn't know how to stop. I didn't know how to change the way I saw you, the way I talked to you, the way I treated your achievements. I was trapped in my own fear, my own limitations. The conversation was painful but necessary, like surgery that had to happen to save something vital. I could feel the wedding guests watching us, but they had faded into background noise. This was about my family, about decades of misunderstanding, about the possibility of something different. Sophia stepped forward then, her wedding dress rustling as she moved. Her face was wet with tears, her carefully applied makeup smeared, but she looked more real than I'd seen her in years. Victoria, I'm so sorry, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I'm sorry for asking you to step down as maid of honor. I'm sorry for making you feel like you didn't belong at my wedding. I'm sorry for being so blind to how much I was hurting you. I looked at my little sister, remembering the child I'd read bedtime stories to, the teenager I'd helped with homework, the young woman I'd watched grow into someone I barely recognized. Sophia, I just wanted to be part of your life. I wanted to matter to you the way you've always mattered to me. You do matter, she said, reaching out to take my hands. You matter more than you know. I've been intimidated by you, my whole life, intimidated by your strength, and your accomplishments, and your ability to stand alone. I didn't know how to relate to you, how to be your sister when you seemed so far above me. The words revealed another layer of the dysfunction that had plagued our family for decades. Sophia, I was never above you, I was just different. I chose a different path, but that didn't make me better or worse. It just made me me. She squeezed my hands, her grip desperate. I know that now. I see it now. And I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I'm proud to be your sister. I'm proud to tell people about your service, your rank, your achievements. I just didn't know how to show you that. The conversation continued for several more minutes, my family finally expressing things that should have been said years ago. It was healing and painful and necessary, but it was also incomplete. Because recognition that comes only after public embarrassment, apologies that are offered only when someone is forced to confront their behavior, acknowledgement that happens only when the cost of denial becomes too high. These things have value, but they're not the same as organic, genuine, unconditional support. I appreciated their words, their tears, their apparent recognition of how they'd failed me. But I also knew that this moment, however powerful, was just the beginning. The real test would be whether this understanding would translate into lasting change, whether they would remember this conversation tomorrow, next month, next year. Still, as I stood there surrounded by my family's tears and apologies, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, the possibility of being truly seen by the people who had brought me into this world. Not the diminished version they preferred, not the softened version they'd tried to create, but the full-strength, unapologetic 4-star general who had earned every bit of respect she commanded. It was a beginning, not an ending, but sometimes, a beginning is enough. The days following Sophia's wedding passed in a blur of quiet reflection and unexpected phone calls. I returned to Camp Pendleton with something I'd never carried before: the memory of being truly seen by my family, however briefly, however prompted by public embarrassment. The weight of that recognition settled into my bones differently than the familiar burden of their disappointment had. It was lighter, cleaner, more sustainable. My aide knocked on my office door 3 days after the wedding, carrying a stack of messages that had accumulated during my brief absence. "General, you've received several calls from your family," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "Your mother called twice, your sister once, and your father left a message asking when you might have time for a conversation." I looked at the pink message slips, each one representing an effort to bridge the gap that had defined our relationships for decades. I didn't call them back immediately. Instead, I sat in my office overlooking the Pacific, watching Marines conduct training exercises on the beach below, and thought about what I wanted from these conversations. The public recognition at the wedding had been powerful, but it had also been performative, shaped by the presence of strangers, influenced by social pressure, motivated partly by embarrassment. The real work of rebuilding relationships happened in private, in the quiet moments when there was no audience to impress or disappoint. When I finally called my mother back, her voice was different, tentative, careful, stripped of the confident authority she'd always used when discussing my life choices. "Victoria, I've been thinking about what happened at the wedding," she said, her words measured and slow. "About things I said, things I didn't say, ways I treated you that I'm not proud of." She paused, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. "I want to understand. I want to do better, but I don't know how." The admission was more honest than anything she'd said to me in years. "Mom, I don't need you to understand everything about my career," I said, choosing my words carefully. "I need you to respect it. I need you to trust that I've made choices that were right for me, even if they weren't the choices you would have made." We talked for an hour, not solving everything but beginning to map the territory of a different kind of relationship. Sophia's call came 2 days later, while I was reviewing deployment schedules for the upcoming quarter. Her voice was softer than I remembered, less confident, more vulnerable. "Victoria, I keep thinking about what you said at the wedding. About wanting to be part of my story instead of just a footnote. I realize I've been treating you like a footnote in my life for years." The conversation that followed was different from any we'd had as adults. She told me about watching me leave for military service when she was still a teenager, about feeling abandoned but also feeling proud. She talked about the difficulty of having a sister whose achievements overshadowed her own, about the way she'd learned to deflect conversations about my career because she didn't know how to talk about something so far outside her experience. "I want to learn," she said finally. "I want to understand what your service means, what your rank represents, what it costs to do what you do. I want to be the sister you deserve, but I need you to teach me how." The request was simple but profound, not a demand that I make myself smaller, but an offer to expand her understanding to include me. My father's call was the most difficult. He asked if I could come home for a weekend, not for any special occasion but just to spend time together. "I want to hear about your work," he said, his voice heavy with years of missed opportunities. "I want to understand what I've been missing, what I've been too stubborn or too scared to see." The weekend visit was awkward at first, both of us navigating unfamiliar territory. But gradually we found our rhythm. I told him about the Marines I'd commanded, about the operations I'd planned, about the weight of making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He listened with the focused attention he'd never shown before, asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than polite obligation. "I always thought the military was something you did until you figured out what you really wanted to do with your life," he said on Saturday evening as we sat on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "I didn't understand that it was what you wanted to do with your life. I didn't understand that service could be a calling, not just a job." The admission revealed the depth of his misunderstanding, but also the possibility of something different. We talked about sacrifice and purpose, about the meaning of leadership, about the pride that came from serving something bigger than yourself. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like my father was seeing me, not the version of me he'd wanted me to be, but the person I actually was. The most significant change came in the form of a letter I received 6 weeks after the wedding. It was from David's parents, Colonel and Mrs. Chen, but it wasn't addressed to me personally. Instead, it was a letter they'd sent to the Marine Corps Times, which had forwarded it to me with a note that they were planning to publish it in their upcoming issue. The letter described the wedding reception, the moment when Colonel Chen had saluted me, and the family dynamics they'd observed. But it went deeper than that, exploring the broader issue of how military families were treated, how service members were supported or failed by their loved ones, how recognition and respect were earned and withheld. "We write this not to embarrass anyone," the letter concluded, but to highlight a truth that many military families struggle with. That service requires sacrifice not just from the individual but from everyone who loves them. When families fail to honor that sacrifice, when they minimize achievements or question choices, They do a disservice not just to their loved one, but to the entire military community. The letter generated responses from military families across the country, sharing their own stories of recognition and rejection, of support and disappointment. Reading those letters, I realized that my experience wasn't unique, that many service members struggled with families who couldn't or wouldn't understand their choices, who treated military service as a phase rather than a calling. But I also received letters from families who had learned to bridge that gap, who had found ways to celebrate service even when they didn't fully understand it. These letters gave me hope that change was possible, that understanding could be cultivated, that respect could be earned and maintained over time. The months that followed brought gradual but significant changes in my family relationships. My mother started asking specific questions about my work, learning the difference between ranks and understanding the significance of various assignments. My father began introducing me to his friends not as my daughter who's in the military, but as my daughter, General Victoria Sterling. Sophia sent me articles about women in combat, about military leadership, about the changing role of women in the armed forces. The changes weren't perfect or complete. Old patterns of interaction don't disappear overnight, and there were still moments of tension, still conversations that revealed the depth of our previous misunderstanding. But there was also something new, a foundation of respect that hadn't existed before, a recognition of my worth that didn't depend on my willingness to be diminished. 6 months after the wedding, I received a call from Sophia with news that would test everything we'd built. She was pregnant with her first child, and she wanted to ask me something important. Victoria, if it's a girl, David and I want to name her after you. Not Victoria, that's your name, but we want to give her a name that represents strength, service, honor. We want her to grow up knowing about her aunt, who broke barriers, who served her country, who never apologized for being extraordinary. The request moved me more than any medal or promotion ever had. It wasn't just about a name, it was about legacy, about the story that would be told to the next generation, about the example I would set for a niece who might choose her own unconventional path someday. Standing in my office, watching the sun set over the Pacific, I realized that the recognition I'd been seeking my whole life had finally arrived. Not in the form I'd expected, not without struggle and confrontation, but genuine and lasting. I was no longer the family member who didn't quite fit, the daughter who had chosen the wrong path, the sister who needed to be managed and minimized. I was General Victoria Sterling, and my family finally understood what that meant. 2 years later, I stood in the same rose garden where Sophia's wedding had taken place, but this time I was wearing my dress blues, my 4 stars gleaming in the afternoon sun. My 18-month-old niece, Honor Victoria Chen, tottered toward me on unsteady legs, her tiny hands reaching for the ribbons on my uniform. "Aunt Tori!" she squealed, using the nickname she'd invented for me. I scooped her up, and she immediately began examining my medals with the fascination only a toddler could muster. "Pretty," she declared, touching the Medal of Honor with reverent fingers. "Honor, can you say General?" Sophia asked, her voice filled with pride as she watched her daughter interact with me. The little girl looked at me seriously, her dark eyes, so much like her grandfather Colonel Chen's, studying my face with intense concentration. "General Tori," she said carefully, then broke into a grin that lit up her entire face. "My general!" The words hit me harder than any salute ever had. This child would grow up knowing that women could be generals, that service was honorable, that strength was something to be celebrated rather than apologized for. She would never question whether her achievements were too much, never wonder if she needed to make herself smaller to be loved. My mother appeared beside us, her face soft with emotion. "She's going to be extraordinary," she said quietly, "just like her aunt." The words carried decades of understanding, of growth, of recognition, finally freely given. I looked around at my family, my parents, my sister, my brother-in-law, my precious niece, and felt something I'd never experienced before. Complete acceptance. Not because I'd changed, but because they had learned to see me as I was. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields. Sometimes they're won in rose gardens, one conversation at a time. Where are you watching from tonight? Is it a quiet evening where stories like this make you think about your own family, your own struggles for recognition? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that you don't need anyone's permission to be extraordinary, please hit that subscribe button. Join our community of people who believe that everyone deserves to be seen, valued, and celebrated for who they truly are. Remember, you are enough, exactly as you are. And sometimes, the recognition you've been waiting for comes from the most unexpected places.